Hello and welcome to those who have come before us, the second episode of the IFSA webinar on forestry and gender. I'm Barbara Oellerer, the head of the IFSA Forests and Women's Hands Task Force. I'm also coordinating the organization of the Forests and Women's Hands Conference for the Austrian Research Center for Forests, together with IUFRO, IFSA and Forstfrauen, which is the Austrian Women in Forestry Association, and supported by the Austrian Ministry. Today, I am here as IFSA representative, and I'm happy to invite you to join the conference, the Forest and Women's Hands Conference, from the 12th to the 13th of April, meaning early next week. The conference will be held online and it's possible to participate for free. IFSA is one of the organizing partners of the conference. We feel that as youth, we have to speak up since the forestry sector faces many challenges connected to gender equality. And it is an important topic for IFSA because we also want to be an inclusive organization. As our contribution to the conference, we have planned several activities for the in-person event, but now also for the online event. One of them is this webinar series leading up to the conference. It is preparation for the conference. We also want to go beyond what is discussed at the conference to discuss different topics and also to offer an online learning opportunity for IFSA members and everyone interested. Last week, we had the first episode. It was about Me Too, the Me Too movement, especially in the Swedish forestry sector. NUX, a network that was established afterwards for women and non-binary forestry professionals, and about gender in organizations. And I would like to thank Elin Olofsson and Maria Johansson once again for the incredible episode. I will later on post the link to the recording in the chat because it is now available on YouTube. Thanks go also out to the IUFRO Task Force on Gender Equality for their contribution to this webinar, especially with the initial development of the series. And I would like to end this introduction with a quote from last week by Elin Olofsson: "Just by speaking up, the power distribution shifts." And with this motto, I want to start this discussion that we'll have with our wonderful guests today and hand it over to Damiano Ciglio, another member of the IFSA Forests and Women's Hands Task Force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Hi, everybody. Good morning, afternoon, evening, night to all of you. And it's a pleasure for me to be here. And thank you for the introduction to the second and last episode of the webinar. And thank you for the introduction of myself. So I would moderate this episode, and I would start with a few comments for the participants. It would be nice if you could rename yourself with your name and adding an hyphen and your country. So just to have an idea of where you are all from. You can just go in the participants and then you can see, you click on the three dots and you can rename yourself. And in case you're going to post on Twitter, please remember to tag ifsa.net. So at ifsa.net, and the same for Instagram. And then an explanation on how the episode will work. We'll have 1 hour approximately where we will ask questions that were previously prepared to the three guests. And the guests don't know the questions. They have an idea of the talking points, but they don't know the questions. So this is because we wanted to create a friendly and conversation. And at the end of this hour, there will be time for questions for the participants. So I invite you to write down the questions in the chat box. You can see there is a Q&A and a chat. Please use the Q&A for the questions. And if you want the questions to be asked to someone specifically, add the name of the speaker that you want to address the question. My colleagues will take care of forwarding me the questions. Then I just wanted to give you reasoning behind this episode, and the idea of the second episode came based on the fact that we wanted to include in our path to learn more about gender in forestry the perspective of women, of people that have already established their career in the forestry field. And this should be represent a source of inspiration for us that will represent the future generations of foresters, so for all the IFSA members. The speakers will tell us about their personal experiences and points of view, and will help us understand how gender matters have played a role throughout their careers, and how we can perhaps compare or estimate ourselves in their situation and try to start a conversation about the present times and reflect on what the next steps are for the future. Without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers. And for today, we have 3 speakers. And I start with introducing Puravi Bose, who is a social scientist working with indigenous and rural forest dependent communities. In her 20 years of international development experiences, she has focused on issues of land tenure, forest rights, climate variability, and food security. 5 years ago, she initiated a self-funded project about forests and people called Landing Together Films. She's a coordinator of the Gender in Forest Research Unit, a gender task force member, and deputy coordinator of social aspects of forests and forestry of IUFRO. Next guest is Kalpana Giri. She is a senior program officer with the Center for People and Forests, RICOFT. She has more than 12 years of action research, project management, and gender on social inclusion experience, implementing development projects. She believes in building international, regional, national, community sector partnerships with demonstrated success in establishing a network of gender leaders through weaving Leadership for Equality program, WAVES. That is currently working across 7 countries in Asia Pacific. She is trained in forestry and has authored several journal papers, book chapters, policy briefs, and conference papers. Last speaker is Eva Miller. She is the Director General for Forest Sustainability and Renewable Resources of the German Federal Ministry for Food and Agriculture. Before, she worked in leading positions with increasing responsibility at the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, in Rome. And as a director of forestry policy and resources, she led the FAO's technical work in forestry. Prior to joining FAO, she worked at the International Tropical Timber Organization, ITTO, in Japan, and at the German Agency for Technical Cooperation in Costa Rica. Just a comment, it's a coincidence that all of them are working or had experience with partners of IFSA, so IUFRO, RICOFT, FAO, ITTO. But I think it's a nice coincidence because, I mean, in the end, the forestry world is always still, it's a small world. So I would start now with the first question. And the first question is probably the most personal, so about your story. We would like to hear your story in short, including, if possible, about how you got into forestry, if you have a family forestry background, and if yes or no, if that played an impact on your study career and your working career, and how you have gotten where you are now. I would start with the order of the bios. So we can start with Puravi, then we go with Kalpana, and then Eva. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me for this excellent webinar, and I'm looking forward to have a wonderful conversation with all of you. To quickly reflect on how did I start, it's a good question. And basically, in those days, like 20 years ago, a career was not always, forestry career was not always first in your list. I mean, you by chance you come across, and for me, that's what it happened. I come from a very poor background. I grew up in a slum, and my brother, he took over when he was at the age of 14. My father died, so he took care of me. He left his education and he introduced me to fulfill my education by working hard. And he was the person who introduced me to forestry. In a way, he would take me to indigenous communities in forest, and we would have theater workshops there with the communities. And it was a movement in using theater. And that's how I got interested in forestry and forest related issues, particularly people and forest. So the rest is just a kind of education and experiences across different institutions. But I think as a child, what you get exposed keeps, it helps you a lot to kind of determine what you want to become. So that's in brief.
Okay, maybe then I will go next. Thank you again for this wonderful space. Happy to have this conversation more and more in future days as well. About me, I come from Nepal, and my dad was an agriculture scientist. So I have seen him really slogging within agriculture fields and doing research trial, you know, with lots of different hybrid varieties and things like that. And at that age of 14, 15, it looked very dirty kind of job. Like I really did not enjoy him being muddy and sloggy all the time. So I always told him that I never wanted to be an agriculturist like you. But then fast forward, I joined my like 10+2 as a science student. So I was actually doing major subjects in biology and botany and so on. And my parents, I think they wished me to see as a doctor. But then while in that university, I was much more interested in botany, but I really didn't want to do something very pure botany kind of thing and be a lab scientist like my dad. So I rather opted to do something which has a much more of a practical avenue to explore more plant-based kind of subjects. And that's when I was introduced to forestry. And I also happened to hear about forestry as a subject, as a career from one of my previous network, and one of the female forester happened to be in the same city where I was exploring my subjects, and I chanced to meet her, you know, by coincidence, and she told me, hello, forestry is like this, you can go into the mountain, you can do this. So that really spoke to me at that moment of time. And I was like, yeah, I don't want to do lab-based kind of science. I wanted to be more like open, you know, that be around nature, and that is much more fruitful. And that's how I ended up choosing forestry.
Okay, thank you. I will continue. Thanks again for inviting me. Well, I do not come from a forestry family. My father was a medical doctor, and I also didn't plan to study forestry. I wanted to study languages, and I started, and after 2 semesters, I realized that was not really what I wanted to do. I had speaking languages in mind, but I didn't want to be a high school teacher teaching languages. So I thought about what else I could do, and I've always loved forests. So I went to the faculty of forestry at the university in Germany, where I was, to get some information and find out what it's like to study forestry. What I found there were forestry students that were all male. They were all dressed like hunters. This was in 1975. They all had their little hunting dogs with them, and there were no women. And at that time, I didn't have the courage, or also felt very uncomfortable in this environment. I didn't want to be the first woman. So I did the next best thing which is to study biology. Later on, I did study forestry. I went to Yale University in the US and got a master's degree there. And the gender issue was not an issue there. We were 50% women in our semester, and it was something that wasn't even talked about. In Germany, forestry has a long tradition, is a very conservative profession, and it's changing now, but it's changing slowly. And at that time, women just didn't study forestry. So that's my story.
Thank you. I find it interesting because also I've seen part of my background and how I got into forestry in parts of your stories, and I'm sure that many others had the same. I would like then to, since you talked about your stories, to ask you to share with us, if you have, an anecdote connected to your career as a student or as a professional, related to something happened in your life that was involving gender matters or social matters. And we start on with the opposite direction now. We start with Eva, and then Kalpana, and then Purabi.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I can actually just continue my story because at the end of my biology studies, I participated in a 1-month field course in the Ivory Coast, where deforestation at the time was a big issue. And for me, this was really a revelation, and I found my destiny because I decided that I wanted to work in tropical forestry. So I wrote my thesis in Senegal on indigenous trees, and then I studied forestry at Yale because they had a program focusing on tropical forests. After finishing my master's, I looked for a job and in tropical forestry, and being a German, I applied at the GIZ, the German Agency for International Cooperation. There I was told that they had no jobs for me because A, I did not have a German forestry degree with the typical practical year that you have to do in a German forest. And they also said it was difficult to send women overseas because they usually had husbands that had to be taken care of somehow. So that was really shocking to me at the time, that they would tell me something like this. And I don't think today they would be able to do that anymore because we've had the Me Too movement, we've had a lot of things happening. But back then, they actually told me this. Fortunately, the leadership in the forestry department at the time in GIZ also changed later on, and the attitude started changing. And I ended up working for GIZ for 10 years in Costa Rica in the forestry project. So in the end, it worked out, but it was quite amazing, you know, the things that you were told at that time. Okay, that was my anecdote.
Okay. For me, I would say that when I first, like usually in Nepal, if you have to go to a forestry education, you go through a very competitive test and you have to get good scores and you have to secure a seat. So I secured a seat, and I remember the first day when I actually went there, and then both like male and female students were asked to run, you know, like half a mile. And then there would be a teacher who would tell us, yes, you are now qualified to be a forester. So that is kind of really surreal to me. If I remember that incident, like why, what was the need of doing that? And it took me some time to realize that forestry is often, you know, like construed as a very tough and, you know, like fit kind of sector. And that is one of the parameters the sport teacher was putting and testing on both male and female candidates. But then it was applicable to both the genders of that time. Slowly, the type of narratives that I used to hear in my first year of school, forestry school, was, oh, you are so tender, you know, you are so feminine. Why did you choose forestry as a sector? You would be more suited to go to medical field and things like that. So, and those narratives were very consistent, I would say. It was not like 1 or 2% saying those things. It was the narrative, the dominant narrative, where like most of the people that I'm interacting is really asking my question of why I even decided to come to forestry. So as if I'm unwanted, as if I'm not a good fit for the sector. And at that time, I just carried out with that question. It was kind of tough because you wanted to enter into a sector with your own passion and with your own outlook for career options and how you really want to be in the sector. And that kind of narratives kind of make you feel that you are not really a good fit, right? And it kind of puts you into a space where you are questioning yourself constantly. So I think I battled with that kind of identity and really like trying to figure out, am I really not a good fit just because I look feminine or I was tender? And I was 18 at that point of my time, right? So I was not 30 where I would process it very clearly and consistently. So I was 18 and I was trying to struggle with like, what does that definition really mean to me as being a female, but also being a forester. So that also always sound like a constant battle to each other, you know, and I think that's where I started kind of exploring it further and really asking the questions of why is it happening, whether my male friends are also asked the same question or not, and if not, why not? What is it about forestry that really sees them as fitting into the forestry sector, and why do I really not fit within that whole description? And slowly over the years, what I really found out is that in Nepal, and I think it's when Eva was describing the very conservative narrative about the profession, in Nepal also we really have a very masculine notion of what forestry is and should be. And sometimes we even have visual symbols of what a forester would look like. And I would give you an example that when we are about to graduate, like we're in the last semester of our 4-year undergraduate degree, most of our male friends would start to put on weight. They would start to put on beard. I'm not sure why Damiano is putting that beard, but in our case, like even the male friends who are, you know, let's say with the normal growth and everything, they'll put on weight, they'll put on beard, they will put on a characteristic to look more mature than of their age, to look more a person with more weight, so that they can speak to a certain power status and co. So male has those ways of proving themselves or presenting their attire as a forester, whereas as women we're kind of figuring out, okay, what should we be doing, you know, what is our avatar to be a forester and a female. So I think I would end my story up to here, and I would let you guys explore more. Thanks.
On my defense, I started to grow my beard when I was at the bachelor, the first year. Please, Purabi.
Just to be brief about the anecdote that that I can think of is I began my career with NGO, and then I moved to philanthropy, and then with International Research Institute working with C4. Then I worked in Potsdam, Germany for a think tank. Then I moved to Colombia working with CGI's other organization called CIAT. And eventually I became, I did some freelancing as a filmmaker. And in this 2 decades of career, I never had a woman boss, not a single. I didn't even have a second boss as a female. Like, you know, you have the first as a big head, and then you have the second or the third. There was none. There was not a single in my entire career. And that is a real shocking experience that I had till 5 years ago, because till then I was still working with an institution, and now I'm doing as an independent. And I must be honest about it that initially I accepted that's the way it is. And it seemed that I was the first one to break all those career paths. But then eventually I realized probably that's not how it works. There should have been change. There should have been more women given the opportunity and chance to become, because if you don't allow women to grow up and give that opportunity to work in the forestry sector, there will not be enough women even after 10 years to take up those lead roles. And I think just to kind of wrap up about this entire anecdote is the idea of you as a young student, when you join in, and as a young professional, grow over the period of time, you tend to realize about gender. So you don't begin thinking about men and women differences as strongly as you tend to grow up. And I think that's a career path also helps you to understand, because that's the way the society also functions. It's a way how the entire institutions are managed within forestry. And I'm glad to see it is changing now. And that's the best part of what I would say this entire webinar also, that we are talking about it. And these things didn't exist 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago. So this is excellent opportunity for younger generation to understand that, you know, how we all 3 of us have struggled through in a different period of career, but it requires to be changed.
Thank you. And it's surprising how you have all touched many of the points that we want to ask you. And I don't know where to start now, because I had an order, but then you touched so many things. So I'll try to follow let's say, a career path. And I would start with Kalpana. And the question is, what was your experience as a female forestry student and young professional? How did you feel? How did you navigate around it? And if you looking back to the situation now, what would you wish to have back then to make things different, if?
Okay, thank you so much. So I think let me quickly share some of my experiences with you and how I actually navigated around that. So like in the Forestry College around 1998 up to 2002, that's the period that I'm talking about, almost like 20 years before. But then in that, one of the major unspoken rule within forestry is that male are the leaders and women need to support that. But it's an unspoken narrative. And somehow within the forestry herd, everyone is kind of accepting that narrative. Like Puravi is saying, it happens so consistently that you kind of take it as a rule and you apply it to yourself, right? So I always used to face this distinction that in whole my school and everyone, I wanted to try things on my own. So even if it's a assignment, I wanted to give a try. If it's about writing an essay, I wanted to do that, right? I did not really seek for help until and unless I feel the need to. But within the forestry spaces, the usual trend is that most of the time it's the male friends who would take the lead, and you as a female just sit with them and you give a good company, and then they will help you. They'll kind of support you in writing the essay. They'll really do all the like all the burden for you, I would say. And if you are that female who would really take on that type of avatar, you are kind of accepted and you are even celebrated. Like both male and female in that role is celebrated. But I, just because I wanted to try things on my own and I saw that as a way of my own learning and growing, I started to feel that I'm treated a little differently, right? And from my perspective, I felt like, what's the wrong in me trying to learn something that should not be really taken as something defying the norms or whatever. But then from their perspective, as I now reflect back, what I was doing is I was not following the usual norm, right? The usual rule that is so prevalent and so widely accepted within the forestry space and culture, which was that male are the ones who are going to take the lead. And as a female, you have to support that. Second thing, I also faced it because I started to excel in my studies. So in my classroom, like we have 45 students, and out of those only 5 are females. So when I started to excel in my studies and started top in my class, then I used to hear the reactions like, not congratulations, you did well, or wow, you should really continue this, but more about what did you write in your sheet that you got so much marks, can you share out? But it was more of a remark, a snide that came my way. And I was kind of struggling with that, because if someone of my friend is excelling at something, I would always have the habit of going and congratulating that person and say that, bravo, you really did well. But I was not getting the same type of response. So just to summarize this, I think what the overall experience was that there was this unchecked assumption of male being a leader within the forest space and female taking a subordinate or supporting role that I was defined through my action, through my excellence, name it the way you want, right? But I was unaware that I was actually doing it. I was totally unaware. It happened because I was good in studies. It happened because I wanted to learn and try to do things and, like learn something out of the profession. So how I actually navigated through that was, it was kind of tough, because at times you feel like why you are actually getting it, instead of being celebrated for your excellence, instead of being, accepted in a group, you are kind of ostracized for being little different, for not following certain things that you don't feel like following. So there is a little bit of kinship and herd kind of culture within forestry spaces, very, very prevalent, where male excellence is given and female excellence is always kind of questioned or not accepted, right? And if you are one of those females with that type of attributes, you are going to face the troubles. How did I navigate through that? I think I was very, very headstrong, because if someone really starts to give me a tough time, I'm like, okay, come on, give me the shit. I'll give the shit back now, right? So I was raised very headstrong by my parents. Like, I never felt discrimination in my family until I experienced the forestry circle and tried to figure out what is happening. So I was very, very mentally strong, and I really took it with the stride, I would say. That's one. So I never gave it to this. I focused a lot on my studies. Like, excellence was my, like the key way to navigate around it. Like, no matter what you do, I'm going to excel, and come on, and you just beat me on this one. So I think I also took it on that way at that moment of time. But another thing that really helped me was that time, there was some pink booklet that was produced by an organization called ISIMOD. And there, I think a person named Jeanette Gurung was the gender advisor of that organization. And what she used to do was that she used to collect these little stories of foresters throughout different, who are working throughout the world. And they would actually write about their experience of what it means to be a female forester. So in one day, while in the library, I happened to read those stories, and it felt like my story, right? And for the first time, then I felt like there's something beyond me. It was not a personal resistance or personal struggle that we are having. There's a bigger power relations in play. There's something called gender that is actually affecting us. And I think getting to know that, it was really something that I would say that liberated me as well, because it was always kind of a battle that I also had to pull through in those discussions. And after that, I started to learn a little bit more about gender. What does it mean? What does forestry sector look like from a gender perspective? I even brought it into the forestry research that I was doing. So I think if I were to reflect back, then one thing that I would really say is that the first space, just because it was like there were so many males still in many of the institutions, the culture of forestry spaces is highly masculinized. And it's so highly masculinized and normalized that nobody sees it. So if there were some revisions that I could make, I would really place a mirror and really show that this is how masculine the space is, where males actually get the privilege because you are just being a male, but female are constantly questioned and ostracized because of that spaces. So I think naming the masculinized spaces and its harmful effects both on females, but also on males, I think that is something that would have been very, very helpful. Okay, I stop here.
Thank you. And well, actually, as Barbara has introduced the episode, we decided on the speakers together with the IUFRO Gender Task Force leader. And she mentioned to us about two main ways of approaching the forestry field as a woman. And one is adapting to the system, as you were saying, and the other one is to challenging it, which is something that honestly, myself, I've never heard before. So there is always something new to learn about gender and communication and social issues in forestry, and we're often still quite poor in terms of that knowledge. So thank you for bringing this up. Just, do you have anything you wish you had back then? Now thinking of the situation, or you would do everything again like the same way?
No, I would definitely, for example, have some teachers or someone, at least some more female teachers and students that I can go and talk my minds and hearts out, because even that was missing. We did not have any female faculty while I was a student. We have one faculty, but she was teaching English. So the dynamics of forestry as a masculine space is a very, very remote discussion for her to even engage with us. I think that's one, because the voice and the space was not there, right? That is one. But another thing is calling out, this is something like a norm and the cultural thing where people really don't have a conversation about. And I think it is important to have this conversation about whether or not the forest spaces, not only universities, the workspaces, even the forest subject itself is masculinized to the extent that it is actually creating exclusion for women and non-binary groups. So I think that kind of discussion and conversation would have been helpful. We also did not have any student group back then to even have that kind of conversation. So we kind of went with the flow of what is considered normal, what is considered acceptable, and many people went through that flow. And I would not really criticize them because it was considered normal thing to do, right? But then
Yes.
As a person, I felt like it was not normal for me. I should call it out, right? But when you call it out, you actually face also consequences because the system was not ready. So I would really focus on having a system that initiates conversation, that provides spaces and connects gender with the forestry sector subject.
Thank you. Then I think I'm going to change again the order of my questions because you brought a really interesting point, and I think this question is one of the most important to us as forestry students and young professionals. And I'm going to address these to Eva. What was the role of allies or mentors or role models in your career? And if you had any, or if you haven't had any, what do you think it should be for us students, their role for our preparation for the beginning of our careers?
Thank you. Just trying to think if I had any role models. Very few, actually. And you know why? Because the role models that I would have liked to see would have been women, and there were no women in leading positions, or very, very few. So throughout my career, most of my colleagues, bosses, and so on, they were all men. I've also never had a female boss. As when you were saying that earlier, I was thinking, did I ever have a female boss? No, I didn't. But there were a few women along my career who were inspiring, definitely. And I'm just thinking now of Marilyn Hoskins, who used to be with the FAO, who was one of the first women in tropical forestry who did a lot of work. And I got to know her relatively early in my career. And I would say that was a person who inspired me. But I think I made my way, despite the fact that I had no role models. Actually, I became a trailblazer in many ways because I was the first forestry director in FAO. I was the first forestry director in ITTO. I'm the first female director general of forests in my current position. So it's always been a first. There had never been a woman before me.
There is something that it's particularly important for me, and as I'm getting more and more aware of the social needs that we have in the forestry field, and is something I've noticed is that when we talk about these topics, the percentage of genders is usually what we like women, or let's say few men are involved or interested in the topic. And something that as IFSA we wanted to have is to make sure that, for example, who was working in the task force to organize these activities was also representing the male gender. And because we believe it's important that we should all help each other. So it's not the fight of women and of non-binary genders, but it's the fight of all of us, and we should all work in that. So still to Eva, did you have any allies from non-women gender supporting your career and helping you achieving your goals and fighting for your rights?
Yes, I would say I had allies, and these allies were often men, because it's not that men are not sensitive to gender issues in general. Many men may not be, but there are also men who are quite sensitive to this. and to actively promote women. And throughout my career, I've met quite a few of those. And not only promoting me, but also promoting others, especially in the international work. So that was actually also part of what inspired me, when I ran into people, men in general, who had the sensitivity and who became allies that way. Yeah, so that is important.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to another question now for Purabi. This is a question related to your last 5 years of your career. And I mean, something I've noticed reading your bio and also checking your website came to my mind is that not only the forestry field, it's often male dominated, but usually, I don't know if that's the case in your experience, but usually also the film environment, movie environment, cinema environment, it's often really male dominated. And so it was interesting for me to see someone with a forestry background choosing to focus especially on communication. And so I have two questions connected to this. One is, what was your experience trying to jump into this possibly also in your case, a male-dominated field? And also, why did you choose films, movies as a medium to tell your stories, to tell about Indigenous women's stories?
I'll take your last question and answer it first. Why? Because my mother was an illiterate woman. She would read and write, but then she never had her education certificate or degrees. She just did a primary school, and so I am the first person in my entire history, thanks to my brother, for ensuring that I get educated. But then I soon realized that when we talk about forestry, when we talk about all the information that we have about forest and people, we are not reaching out to a larger audience. We are just talking to ourselves. And communicating was the biggest issue for me. Like, I'm writing in English, I'm writing in special issues, I'm writing in journals, but who's reading it? Who are the audience? Am I reaching it only to the same forestry circle, or I'm reaching out to a larger audience where I would really like to communicate about the real issues? And that's the reason why I thought of my mother as a background. Like, if I have to tell her what is a forestry, what do we want to change, and what am I doing actually in the forest when I go to the field, and when I work with indigenous community and I come back, she's like, I still don't understand. Do they really pay you for this? And so for me to explain her what is the role, she understands, because she used to understand, because she was an indigenous woman. She was a Santhal indigenous. She came from a Santhali indigenous. So it was a forest dependent community. And for her, she ran away from this indigenous community. She didn't wanted to marry an indigenous person. She married a non-indigenous person. So therefore, I don't recognize myself as an indigenous woman. But then just to bring back the communication aspect is that when we want to reach out those messages to the larger community who are unable to read and write, but they are very much forefront in the movement of conserving the forest and ensuring the nature, film is the most important career of reaching out, and because you don't need languages. And when I chose, your first question was about, sorry.
Since filmmaking is often a male-dominated career, yeah, how was it for you, if you had experienced any complications or, right, I mean, your experience basically with that?
Right. So just to continue with what I was saying is, like, when I started making films, I started making films in the original languages of the people. I didn't push them, and I ensured that my films doesn't have voiceover, because that kills the whole purpose. I was very fortunate that indigenous groups in FAO supported my initiative, and they funded the travel grant for my entire initiative. Because when I reached out to funding bodies, the first thing they asked me was, do you have a degree in communication? Do you have degree in forestry? And I said no for both, because I'm not a forester and I don't hold a degree in filmmaking. So without having a degree in forestry, without having a filmmaking certificate, you are not eligible to ask for funding. And that was the outright, I'm like rejected. But then what I noticed is, when it comes to women filmmaking, they have a lot of challenges, not just in terms of their educational background, but also the fact that filmmaking is considered a male domain in and out. Just to give an example, like even today, Oscar is considered supposed to be the biggest award, biggest award in the world. And you don't see many film directors as women. You don't see women camera person. You don't see women script writers. So these are the challenges that women have been facing in filmmaking. And the reason is primarily because even if there are women filmmakers, they hardly take up the forest or nature or environment issues, very few, because these are again the challenging parts, because you have to go to the interior of a country, you have to travel, and you have to work with male colleagues. All my communication team members were all men, camera person, animation, and I couldn't find, not because I wanted all the men, because I couldn't find any female camera person who would be willing to go into a conflicted forest area, or forget about going there, to find one, and who would be. So even if there are few women filmmakers, they tend to choose a career path which are more mellow, or which are not challenging. So some of the challenges, I would say, are mainly because we need to change again. It's a challenging task, not because women are not talented in filmmaking, or women are not talented in forest and social aspects. It's just that there needs to be a chance that needs to be provided to those young people. And I think that's the most important part.
I can take this opportunity to say that there are in IFSA some talented people that are good with software skills and starting, like, you know, how to make movies and stuff. So hopefully you'll get to work with someone from IFSA. And it's an invitation from the IFSA people to listen to these words and maybe change their plans and go to communications. Okay. Then a question for Eva. And you have previously, your previous work experience with the FAO, and then now you're working for the German ministry. So you moved from an international body to a national one. Have you perceived any differences in terms of how gender matters are approached? And also another topic that has been mentioned before is which are the barriers that can, let's say, interfere with women trying to reach leading positions and, yeah, let's say to scale the hierarchy in a vertical direction?
Well, in FAO, like in many international organizations, there was a gender policy for the people who worked in FAO. And while I was there during the time, I would say that the number of women working in FAO steadily increased. And but the big issue was that it increased more at the lower level, the lower professional levels, but not at the high level. So while I was there, there were never more than 20% women at the director level. And I was one of them. That didn't change much at all. So while women were given more opportunities at the professional level, and they were also overrepresented at the administrative level, at the leadership level, there were still very few. And I never managed to, I reached the glass ceiling at some point, because the next step for me would have been to become the head of the forestry department, the assistant director general. But there, nationality became a criteria that was more important than gender. So that was the international experience. Here in Germany, in the ministry, I must say they have very, very strong rules. They also have a person who is responsible for gender issues, a lady who participates in all the recruitments and makes sure that that there is equal treatment of men and women in the recruitment processes. And she also serves as a focal point or contact point for grievances. If you have the feeling that you're not treated right as a woman, for example, you can go to her and talk to her. The ministry is also a little bit conservative, and we have now a female minister who has made a big point of hiring more women into leadership positions. And I think that's a good thing, but previously, I must say, in the ministry, also in the leadership positions, it was quite thin. Most of the director generals of the different departments were men. So in that way, it doesn't differ so much, but they pay a lot of attention to it, to the issue, and there is a conscious effort to make sure that there is equal treatment of men and women. I think it's also a legal thing. You have to make sure, as a ministry, that nobody can actually launch a complaint against you for not treating women equally. And this is why they also have this person who has the task to make sure that this is not happening.
Thank you. Now, since we started more or less 1 hour ago, I would just go for one question each, and then we give space to questions from the participants. So I'll try to pick the interesting questions for you. Okay, starting with Kalpana. We were particularly impressed when we had the meeting with you to discuss, when we invited you to join the webinar, about how you were highlighting the importance of connecting with youth and how it's important to involve us as stakeholders in future generation. And therefore, I would like to ask you, considering that, as I also mentioned before, gender is not a topic that's sufficiently discussed in our training. Like in my career, never had any course, not even close to gender, not even social matters, not even communication, of course. So our topics are not often discussed, and often we are also not aware about it. But still, they have a strong influence on us. How do you think youth, forestry students, can take action, starting from getting informed, learning more about gender, and working their first steps into this for many new social aspects?
Okay, all right. What needs to be done? Let me just think about this a little bit. What I really feel where there's a space, especially for young foresters, is actually, like acknowledging that there are differences between foresters and among foresters. I think that's the first thing, to have that space where even IFSA, all young members, male, female, different ethnicity, different non-binary groups, to first come and share your experiences of whether you're accepted within the forestry space or not. And if not, why not? What factors actually created that kind of situations for each of you? So I think as a young person, you have this language and a little bit of more acceptance with the generation to talk about critical issues that creates inequality in the first place, where you can talk about your experiences and really accept that, okay, these are some of the factors that lead to privileges. These are some of the factors that lead to exclusion. So I think the first space for IFSA as a young forester is to create that space where young foresters with different backgrounds can actually come and share that experience, and not only talk about gender, but gender and its intersection with other factors like ethnicity, like income level, education level, exposure, nationality, right? North, South, things like that. So I think creating that space, you already have a very good space where you can actually initiate that type of discussion. Second thing where I also wanted to point is that whenever we think about gender discussion in forestry, this discussion needs to move beyond the numbers. This discussion needs to connect with the relevance of gender as a subject with the forest science. And why I wanted to put that point across IFSA forum, because you young foresters, when you graduate from your universities and have to work, you have to unpack and address the social dimensions of forestry, for which, I'm sorry to say this, you are least prepared. Because in none of your university education, they are teaching subjects on social topics or on gender topics. So all of a sudden you are thrown into this job market trying to understand why safeguard is important. You wanted to make business cases, you want to come up with solutions. So from a gender perspective, I would also say that as IFSA, I think you also need to call out for the lack of social topics and gender topics in your curriculum within the forestry science, because forest science itself is very narrowly depicted as a wood science for now, which has huge issues, not only for forestry students, but also for the beneficiaries that we work with. Like indigenous communities' perspective of forestry is very different than how forest science defines forestry. And that is a major source of conflict as well. Right? So if you are a person who really wanted and passionate to solve about forest issues, degradation, climate change, you need to understand how power relations create exclusion within the forestry work that you are doing. So calling out for revising the curriculum, bringing the topics of social topics, gender topics, and how it affects forest policies, forest extensions, how it affects tenure, how it affects access, how it affects reach of certain groups over the other. I think that is fundamental for your own growth as a forester. Right. And I think I really can call this out, because though I have been trained as a forester, I have been quite fortunate enough to work with many different mentors, who has much more interdisciplinary background. And I think I was really tutored well from that. I really wanted to mention Ika Danhofer from University of Bodenkultur in Austria. She was my PhD mentor, and she really gave me this new perspective from social science of how do you even view around political relationship and how that governs forest access and control. So as a forestry student, I think work on two things. One, pick on the conversation. I think the way I look at IFSA is that you guys need to be more than us, because you guys are our future, right? You need to be more progressive. You need to be calling it out. You need to dare the risk, and as a collective network, I think there's a huge potential to do that. But if you just talk it about numbers and do not link it with forest science, then what happens is they are progressive people, but then the forest science is actually backtracking you, right? You are still talking about only wood science, which is not going to give you all the answers in the real practice. So establish gender as a subject of relevance in forestry universities and in the curriculum. Thank you.
Thank you. These are other points that we have been recently discussing as IFSA. And I must say there are, as of what I know, there are few universities that they have courses on gender. So there are some, but there are still not enough. And it should be at least one mandatory course for each of us, because in the end, if it's not about gender, but it's about communicating with the society, we need to communicate with them. And often we have no idea on how to do that. So I totally agree with that. And also, I think as youth, we should be more loud, because we have all the rights, and it's for our future and for who will come after us. So I totally agree with that. Thank you for your points. Then I would go do a step back and go again to a question with a personal content to Purabi, and is how has your work with indigenous communities shaped your view on gender in forestry?
Well, I have been working with indigenous communities across different parts of globe, in India, Indonesia, and in Latin America mostly, and then in East Africa. And one thing that is very common among indigenous communities is the way we understand gender is not how they perceive. The gender word doesn't even exist in many of the indigenous languages. It's a very Western notion. And I think also within the academic thinking of gender, there is a lot of disparity. Often some of my colleagues, including who are working on gender, they work on women focused, and then they link it with the gender. I suppose there needs to be a better understanding that when we talk about gender, it's not just about talking women and their rights, but also equally understanding how men function and what their role are. And that's the kind of a balance between the two. And that's exactly what indigenous communities have been doing. A lot of indigenous communities are very gender balanced, and from that perspective, there is a very little male female divisions of roles that we understand, including the work in forestry. So in certain communities, firewood is collected by men. In certain communities, firewood is collected by women. It just depends on the kind of role they have adopted traditionally, and it is nothing to do with the perception. And that is changing very rapidly with the mainstream projects that is going and being introduced into indigenous territories. We are bringing, including me, I would say, we are bringing our own prejudices about, gender bias. And some of the questions, as a research questions we ask, are based again on our background of urban based or our own of our own understanding of how gender functions. And this is not how exactly the gender. So we have a lot to learn. My important aspect of when we talk about indigenous territories is do not go with your own prejudices about gender. Just go and learn from them. I think indigenous communities have this amazing notion of men and women, and as in line with nature, and they have this idea of mother or a feminine aspect of nature. So then there is a lot of respect towards women's role or towards the gender identity that's associated with feminine. And that's exactly what is changing with when forestry projects are introduced, when foresters are entering the indigenous territories with the idea that men should be doing certain activities and not women. And that brings major damage to their own identity, to the indigenous identity.
Thank you. I'll go to the last question for Eva. And I would like to mention something that I kind of expected you would have said as an anecdote, but I think I can say it because it happened publicly in front of everybody. That 2 years ago, I was the liaison officer for FAO, for IFSA, and I was organizing the delegation attending Urban Forestry Forum in Mantova, and where I quite huge delegation back then when we still could have delegations and travel. And I remember the first day we arrived at the conference, and then the panel, the opening ceremony, like it was a bit late and was not starting immediately as expected from the program. And then when it started, Eva was sitting on the stage together with other panelists. And I have to say, I must admit, I was really surprised about the first words that you said. And when you introduced yourself, saying who you were, working for FAU, your position, and then you said, well, I'm here because they needed a woman to be on the stage, otherwise the finalists were all men. And that's why also the idea of including you in this webinar came from me. And that's why I proposed to include you, because I was really surprised about how straightforward you said that. Like, I don't know. I tried to imagine what I would do, and I think I would be like, I don't know, a bit maybe scared of saying something in such a bold way. And I think it's really inspiring to see someone that says the things in the way they are, especially when we have open ceremony where we have often big words and many fancy things and maybe not concrete points. So I really appreciated that part really a lot. And then made me think about another point connected to IFSA that we have faced many times with IFSA, and also discussing with other students' organization is a common problem that we have faced and we keep facing, and is about the tokenism. That means when we are invited on the stage, not because they want to hear our point of view and they want to include us in the discussion, but more because in a way it's useful for them to show that they have involved youth in the panel. And my feeling about the Mantova opening ceremony, the Congress I mentioned before, was the same, that they had to have someone, a figure, a woman being there to say, yes, we did it. And it's kind of in line with also what Kalpana said about this problem with, we should move behind the numbers. We shouldn't just have Eva there because she's a woman. She should be there because who she is and what she has done, what she can do, what her potential is, and so on. And also, you Eva mentioned before how it might be because of it's a legal thing to guarantee that women are treated equally. So in a way, it sounds like it's a thing that big organizations or governments they tend to do, not because they believe in it, but because they have to do it because of the numbers and because of other problems. And that might be, for example, the case, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but with other underrepresented groups, like might be even with indigenous communities. So I would like to hear your take on this, how you have experienced this in your career, and what are your advices for us as youth trying to get to open our way towards our careers, towards the international policy field, for example? Thank you.
Thank you. Tokenism, yes, I think this is something we encounter both related to gender and also related to youth, because there are keywords. You have to have a woman on the panel and you have to have a youth person on the panel. The gender came first, the youth came later, but in the last years, we've been hearing this again and again, that you have to have somebody from youth there as well. The conference is an interesting example because what happened is that there were 5 people on the stage who were all senior officials who were supposed to open the conference. And one of them was a famous Italian architect. And he realized that there was no woman on the stage. So he started making a fuss before they started the conference. And I saw him, gesticulating wildly, and something was going on there on the stage, a commotion. And then I got a call, you have to go to the stage. So I went to the stage and they had their woman there. But of course, everybody had prepared a speech and I had not prepared a speech, and I was still expected to speak. So what I did is the most obvious thing. I told everybody the story how I got to the stage, and then used that to talk about the issue of gender and forestry. And you know, the lesson learned from that is, yes, if you have the feeling that you are the token, be it woman or youth, you can address that, because once you're inside, you have a right to speak, and that gives you the opportunity to actually address that issue. Because we have the same thing going on boards of institutions, in recruitment processes, and so on and so forth. But once you are the token person and you are inside the board or the recruitment process, you have the opportunity to speak because you're an equal member and you can actually address that issue. And you have to be bold and address it, you know, and make people realize what they're doing, that they're just putting you to have, you know, the number, or to have the woman there, or to have the youth there, but not really thinking about inclusiveness and equal participation. So my advice would be, if you're in a situation like that, be bold and address it.
Thank you. I want to repeat that for me was really inspiring then, and also now he's saying it, that I think be bold and express it. I think it's express how, I mean, how surprised it is and how motivating it is. So thank you very much. Now, I would move to the questions from the participants. And I will start with, I want to also thank you for my colleagues in the background collecting the questions. And I'll start with a question for Eva. What do you think about affirmative actions, quota, for fostering women into leading positions instead of equal opportunities or equal treatment? From Alus Ludwig.
I think quota may be necessary in some areas, because otherwise women just don't get the access they need. I'm thinking here about the boards of big companies, for example, because you know, you have usually you have this old boys club that perpetuates itself, and they don't, by themselves, they don't let the women in. So in a situation like that, at least for a start, quota can be quite helpful. I mean, we all dream of being treated equally, but in some areas, it's just not happening by itself. And if you don't, you know, kind of push it or force it a little bit through quota in some areas, not everywhere, in some areas, I think that's the only way to get in, until maybe in some future, we reach a situation where there is true equal treatment.
Thank you. Perhaps Purabi or Kalpana, do you want to add anything to this?
Yes, maybe I also wanted to respond to that. I think when I said move beyond numbers, I'm not in any way saying that numbers do not matter. They do matter, as a matter of fact, because there is a huge status quo gap between different subgroups of different genders, right? So positive action, affirmative actions are actually important to tackle the underrepresentation of certain groups and bring those voices, provide some space in the table to even listen to those voices. So I think quotas, affirmative actions are very, very important. But the next step is that, okay, now the people are already there. Are they just being treated as token, or is there a real space for decision making? And even when people are actually speaking or sharing their voices, like when Damiano said that could be frightening, right? And here, we usually hear that, yeah, you need to be bold, you need to call it out. And we always have to do that, because as a human, I think you need to take a position and you need to dare it and take some risk to call the system out. But on the other hand, we should also transform the system, right? And I think this is the point that I also wanted to mention, is that while we're bringing, underrepresented voices, let's also work on fixing the system so that the system recognizes that the way it operated was very, very exclusive. And even when people of underrepresented groups wanted to recognize an issue, there was so much of negative consequences that they have to bear, because just for the reason of making that voice, calling out that issue. And I think it's very, very prevalent even now. So I would actually suppose that there should be a two-pronged strategy that runs parallel. On one hand, we have to have work with underrepresentation and the need to tackle that. But on the other hand, we also have to have this bigger conversation within the system and the power inequality within that, and how that continues to perpetuate and maintains the exclusion of certain groups. So I think there needs to be a parallel and complementary approach that needs to go together. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up to Eva and Kalpana's message. I would like to mention that, we are thinking that women are all homogeneous body, and that having a women representative would mean that it solves the issue of women. It doesn't. Oftentimes, men can be better gender sensitive than women, and that's also because by the time women reaches a leadership position, she has been mentored by men, she has been trained in an environment that is so male dominated that she often forgets that to be gender sensitive. And this happens very often, and this is not something that I am saying out of context, but based on experiences, that I sometimes find men to be better bosses than, though I didn't have a direct female boss, I think men have been very gender sensitive in that sense. So it's not about bashing male or female, but also at the same time, having a quota brings down certain, it's looked down upon. And that's where I think it's very sad that once you come with a quota, you are considered marginal, you're considered something that has been given a chance rather than your own struggle, that rather than your own intelligence to be there. And I think it's also the fact that recently I encountered, and I had to raise my opinion about it, that when you have women from global north, it doesn't represent an entire equitable scenario. You need to have a balance between global south. And then you have a representation from global south, you need to understand who are the underrepresented and whom we have missed on the board. So this quota of inclusiveness will continue for a longer duration. It's just that we need to be certain that we are inclusive. We are not just inclusive between men and women, but also inclusive in terms of diversity, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of economic background, in terms of education, in terms of how many indigenous women are being allowed to come to a forum like this to talk about their own experience rather than some experts talking for them. So I suppose this quota system will continue and needs to be continued till we have this social equity in place.
Thank you to the three of you for the splendid answers. I think we are all learning quite a lot today, so it's really nice to hear from the three of you, and that I can already say that I'm truly happy that we have invited the three of you to join us, because I think it's an amazing pick. I'll go to the next question. How do you think that the more economy-focused forestry and the trend towards more restorative forestry are or can be related to gender and the male-dominated tradition of the sector in many places? There is no person indicated for who to ask this. So the first of you who wants to go first.
Okay, maybe Purabi, you want to go first? Go first.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so maybe this is a discussion that when I heard these questions, then I think of two trends that is happening within the forestry work at the moment. One is this whole campaign around restoration, you know, and so many million of plants and seedlings being distributed keeps appearing on my LinkedIn, and I appreciate those efforts, right? And then some of the discussion that I hear happening from my colleague within the region is, in many countries, especially the community forestry approaches, was very much focused on generating a subsistence-based livelihood in the past decades. And now that the timbers have matured, there is a good stock of timber that could be harvested, much more money could be generated. So there's a new focus on using forest and forest resources to a much more market economic kind of model. And within this model, what is now at the risk of disappearing is that the whole concept or the whole dialogue around equity is completely at a miss, right? And when we actually kind of explore, like, why is that happening? Most of the time people, when they talk about economic prosperity, they do not really think about inclusion. And sometimes they pitch inclusion as something that actually barriers economic prosperity. So the thing that I'm trying to throw at the table is this. In most of the forestry discussion, when economic models are actually brought and connected to, they are somehow only pitching for the economic profit model, which is not actually helping to promote the agenda of gender and social inclusion. Sometimes even when inclusion is thought within the economic model, they are again counting the numbers of how many women are there who planted the seedlings, or how many women are there who could be potential entrepreneurs, right? Nobody is actually talking about the workload that women has to bear in this restoration program. Nobody is asking questions about whether the spaces where women go and work within forest companies and factories are safe and free of harassment or not. And these questions, these topics are considered very, very remote topics within the forestry operations of practice, right? And this is the kind of dissonance that I am observing, that on one hand, you know, and I think again, thanks to FAO, you know, the last 2 decades have been a lot of attention around gender and forestry. There have been different networks, and there was a lot of call for community actions, a lot of recognition around indigenous movements. So on one hand, that movement is going on, but when forestry you know, science is taking a new turn, which is now more around using forestry to connect with the economics and bring the economics alive, the whole lessons learned around gender and social inclusion is getting a miss. So I think there's a risk of how do we really balance it. And you can call it as like, okay, economist and maybe inclusion person not talking to each other, but I would say that the real issue here is one, even within the gender and forestry dialogue, I think there are certain positive stereotypes that we have been kind of perpetuating, you know, like even when you are working on gender and forestry, we say, oh, women, they know everything, you know, they do so much. So that's why they need to be there. That's how the previous business cases were made. And it sounds like a very positive thing to say. And in fact, it's true because most of the women actually do the work. But when we perpetuated that without qualifying, what it does, it actually continues to perpetuate the imbalance of workload that women has to bear for forest conservation or for setting the entrepreneurship. Or nobody is actually talking about the right for a safe and dignified workspace for women to work in forest companies. It's more than income generation, right? It's a question of dignity, and nobody is really willing to bring those questions into picture. So do we really wanted forest spaces that are really making huge profits, but where women are getting harassed? Right? I don't think we are really wanting to have that kind of dream for ourselves. Or do we really want to use women's free labor and have like 1 million seedlings planted, and nobody is really giving them, you know, recognition and profit and the ways they really value the forest spaces? So I think these are the questions that I think needs to be discussed further when we think about economic models of forest management or even in the restorative agenda. We need to, that's why I say, start with the numbers, but I think we need to qualify it and really say, is it really benefiting the women of different subgroups or not? Or are we kind of rephrasing it and glorifying some of the imbalances, you know, and it's kind of perpetuated. So I leave it with those questions, not really answers. Thank you.
Thank you. Purabi or Eva, do you want to add anything to this, or should we move to the next question?
Just a
Well,
quick.
Oops.
Sorry.
Just a few words. The question is kind of polarizing. Putting the economics in a male domain and the restoration more in a female domain. I wouldn't see it that way, because women are very good entrepreneurs when given the opportunity, and restoration, like forest management, should have economic, ecological, and social sides to it. So just because you're restoring forests doesn't mean you can't be making money from forests. I think the three have to go hand in hand.
Well, at the community level, I would say that there is a kind of a challenge, and that is when you bring in economics, when you talk about finance, it's often the projects or the activities are often evolves around men, and it's also the fact that a lot of women do not have land tenure rights, so they are not the household head. And it's typical stereotype, very stereotypical in many countries, that men are the household head, and then they are economically more powerful in making certain decisions. And that's very important to keep in mind when we are talking at any level, that when you're talking about gender balance, it has to be understood, especially from economic aspect, that both men and women play a equitable role in this, and especially when it comes to outside projects.
Thank you. There is another question that's goes to with what we have just discussed now, so with the previous question, and is since forestry traditionally mostly consists of physical work, what is your answer to this question that men are better for forestry because they are physically better suited? Again, the first of you who feels like answer, you have the floor.
Okay, well, maybe let me go first, because I really like the like the question. I have really heard it all my university life and still today. Okay, so let me first put it in the perspective of the hard work. Yes, forestry is a difficult field. Okay, in terms of you have to go into deep forest. You are patrolling either for wild animals, either for against loggers. You are really going into different mountains, forest fire and what's not. So it's a difficult field. And it's a difficult field both for male and female, right? But having said that, few people really want that type of lifestyle. Okay, like I never kind of imagined, like sitting into an AC office all my life and not even going on a mountain outdoor, for example. Okay, so even now, though I'm based in a regional position, whenever I get opportunities to go to the field, that's kind of where I feel alive. All right, so and both male and female do it that way. Now, when this whole dichotomy of hard thing for male and soft thing for females comes in, I think that's where the gender nuances become alive. Okay, and some of us, we even believe in that. Like I have been told in my university education that, oh, you cannot really go for that wildlife work because you have to be in the forest and the tiger may come up there, right? So I was always puzzled thinking that why would, if the tiger comes, will it only attack me and not my, not my like male colleague? How would the tiger know just to attack me because I'm a female and I'm weak, right? So it's not the tiger who is making that differentiation. I think the differentiation comes from our deep-seated assumptions, stereotypes, and prejudice of what we have normalized, what is good and appropriate for men, women, and non-binary groups. So first thing, I think I would say that, yes, forest is a difficult field, but what makes it more difficult and inappropriate is not the nature of work per se, because it's difficult for both male and female, okay? Like it's not, let's say, accounting in the sense of you are in an office and doing all that thing, but not to mention that accounting is again an easy subject, no, right? Every subject has its own challenges. But what makes it more difficult is that I think our judgment around what is considered heavy and a good fit for male or female, there's a lot of gendered description that goes unchecked. So I have never believed in that. I think I have been to places all alone on my own. I have been to, you know, camps and things like that. And the risk of abuse, maybe the sexual abuse from loggers, you know, from third parties, sometimes even from your own colleagues, could be there for female, right? But nowadays, with the increasing world, it could also be for male, young male, and people of non-binary genders as well. So I think for me, I really do not agree to that statement. And my response is that we have to question our deep-seated assumptions of why do we even feel like that is kind of an appropriate statement. Right? Thank you.
Thank you. Purabi or Eva, do you want to add anything to this? Okay, let's.
No, not really. I think she said it.
I agree. Okay. We have a question for Eva. Being a young female forester, what gender hurdles and challenges could be there on my way? How can I recognize them and solve them strategically?
That's a very broad question. I think we've talked a lot about possible gender hurdles. So you've heard about some of the things that may come your way and how we dealt with them. I think everybody else has to find their own way of dealing with such issues. There are no general recipes, I would say. And also there are no general solutions. Speaking from my own experience, I very often just didn't pay attention to them. I kind of recognized them in the back of my mind, but I continued doing my own thing without paying that much attention to them. Of course, that doesn't always work because you get into situations where there is just pure discrimination. And that is a lot more difficult to solve depending on what situation you are in. You may not be able to tell your boss you're discriminating against me. It's easy to say stand up and fight for your rights, but from experience, I say that there are situations where that's not so easy to do, you know. So to summarize, I think there are no recipes. Just go your way and, you know, do your thing as good as you can, because if you are good, and I think Kalpana has said this before, you know, when she confronted this masculine forestry world, she was good. She was excelling in her area and she was better than others. That is, of course, a challenge that many women have to live with, because it's often not enough that you are equal to your companions that are male, but you have to be better. But if you're better, then you are less vulnerable, and that helps. Okay, I think I'll stop here and let the others say some more.
I can also add something connected to another question that was made, but I think it's fitting in this. And we have mentioned about that when there is the need, we should be bold, we should call things out, and we should challenge the system, we should fight for our rights. But how did you find the strength to do so? And I'm adding something from my side, is that have you ever been scared of challenging, fighting, and whatever else to promote your career, to defend your rights? We can keep with Eva if you want to, or I don't know who else wants to go. You can go, Eva, if you want to, and then maybe Purabi and then Kalpana.
I'm just trying to think if I have ever been really scared. I cannot think of a situation or a time where I was really scared. As I said, you know, I always tried not to pay too much attention and go my way. And that probably prevented me from getting scared. But I must also say that I have never been in a really scary situation that was gender related. And many women have, so their experiences may be quite different. I'm just talking about my own.
Thank you.
Well, talking about how one comes up with it is the fact that it depends on the characteristic or a personality of the individual. It also depends on what is the economic and independence level. So if a woman is completely independent and is able to manage and give a challenge, then that's the way it is. Oftentimes women do compromise, and that's where the problem happens, where they compromise and they accept that these are natural and these are acceptable. So I suppose that's where the challenge is, that oftentimes they don't even consider a scary situation, and they think that it's normal to continue. And when you, the most difficult is when you challenge certain situations, and when you oppose it, you're not considered as a good woman. You're considered as a woman who is very difficult, a woman difficult to work with. Often I am being labeled as a woman who is difficult to work, primarily because I'm very straightforward. I will tell you that you're socially not inclusive. I will tell you that on your face that you have recruited somebody because she is a woman, and not because she has the capacities. You're not looking at the capacities. And if you stand up on and say directly to your seniors' face, and if you challenge them, it's a very difficult scenario, because it depends on how open they are and how receptive they are, whether they are broad-minded to accept those challenges, or they kind of take a backseat and they think like, oh, this woman is a very difficult person to collaborate with, rather than changing their own style of approach and work. So yeah.
Okay, I think very quickly, I just wanted to add on this one is, how do you actually take a stand, or what do you do, depends on two type of factors. One is your own individual ability and positioning in terms of the situation or the point that you wanted to raise, and the amount of risk that you individually want to take for it, right? And it's an individual call in that matter. Like Damiano may be going forward with one cause, Barbara might really feel for some other cause, right? I may be feeling for one cause that is very close to my heart, and I really wanted to give my 110% to call that issue out. But when we think about forest spaces, I think we have to understand that there are two factors. One is the individual willingness and attributes that come in play, where, like Purabi said, much of our intersectional background, our economic situations, our hierarchy within the organization would come to play. The other factor is how open are the institutions themselves to fix this issue. I think that's another big elephant in the room that also needs to be brought into question, and really like have that conversation within the institutions on why institutions are gatekeeping inequality, right? Why? What is in it for them? Who is benefiting out of that? And I think within this all type of discussion, I would say that the two parallel approach needs to go together. It's not like we can always ask people to be bold and take risks, which many are doing actually within the field. They are really like Purabi said, even I am called like very difficult person to work with, maybe a little bit with humor, but like we have been labeled very differently because we have been questioning the status quo of what has been normalized for so many years. The second thing is more about whether you feel scared and vulnerable within that and not, and how do you deal with that is, yes, I think I have faced many moments when I really faced vulnerable of being only one within the space to even name that issue. And it was like, sometimes you really have so many emotions going on and you are really like struggling. Should I really say this? Maybe not, maybe only when few people are there, so I have struggled with that. But I think where individual bulk actually comes into picture is you take a position and you say, I can take the risk for these girls. And I think it's for all of you to decide what is that within you that you are aiming after, right? And it's an individual call. Everyone will feel passionate about certain things. The other thing is, like, how do you really prepare yourself? And here's the thing for you, all of you, is this: learn about inequality and injustice that is happening in the world, within the country, within the community. Because forestry sector is kind of a microcosm of what is happening in a bigger world. And most of us, we can kind of continue and perpetuate those behaviors, those inequality within forestry sector. So first of all, I think, and here the youth are actually really on the right track. You guys are very, very aware about inequality issues, about justice issues. But sometimes I feel like there is a little bit of dissonance that you can talk about inequality issues so well, but you cannot connect it within the forestry circle, right? So I think there's a need to critically read, but also try to position those issues within the forest spaces and look for the behaviors, look for some of the gaps that you see and call that out and ask why it is happening. I think that's the way you can actually bring your passion and commitment to inequality issues outside within the forestry sector. And for that, I think self-awareness is key. You need to be well-read, but you also need to identify your privileges and your exclusions, right? So both are important, because sometimes what happens is when we work on inequality, we are so open to talk about the discrimination that we face, but we do not talk about the privileges that we are also getting, right? So I think we always have to critically examining ourselves and say that, okay, in this situation, I was able to get this because of this certain factors that actually were helpful to me, but these were really not helpful to me as well. So first of all, I think for me, being honest to yourself is really key, right? And being honest with people around you is also the second step to go around it, right? And all I can say is that the type of decisions that you choose for go in your life from the very early stage of your schools to university to workspaces, it will slowly evolve you into the type of person that you will be in the next 20 years, right? So I would say choose your decision wisely and critically. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I understand it was also really, the last question is really personal, and I appreciate your honesty and your boldness, because I think the best way to inspire people is to be humble and make ourselves looking like we're all the same, so we can impersonate in the other person. And I think you all achieved in this, and I thank you for this really a lot. And I think we have time for one last question, and for Purabi. You mentioned that indigenous communities have their own male-female dynamic. When it comes to work, they do, and when it comes to the work they do, and that those dynamics may not correspond to our gender norms and biases. Have you noticed any differences in these dynamics across continents, working with indigenous communities in different regions? And adding to this, if you perhaps have you want to elaborate more about non-binary people in the indigenous communities, that would be also really welcome.
A lot of indigenous communities have been traditionally are hunter-gatherer communities, and they continue to do that activities even today, which means that some of the questions that was raised earlier, whether men can do certain activities better than women, or those kind of questions doesn't appear. It doesn't come to in their context. The other factor is indigenous communities tends to be or used to be, a lot of them used to be and continues to be matrilineal community, where it's more of women run household, it's more of women run community. And this is primarily because that's how the hunting gathering communities have managed their life. And just to give an example across different continents, or I would say, though they are different communities, but then the common thread is that women play a very critical role in management of forest. For example, in Batwa communities, women know certain indigenous knowledges, these indigenous communities which are worshipped upon, which are like looked upon. They know certain herbs, medicinal herbs and medicinal. So they are the kind of guardians of managing and protecting this forest plants and forest herbs, which provides them a kind of certain status in the community as a knowledgeable person, which helps the younger generation of women, because it's often the knowledge is often transferred from mother to daughter or daughter-in-law. And that's one aspect I would say from indigenous. In the same way, Quechua community in Ecuador have been very forefront about the fact that their language, the matrilineal language that they have been speaking, should continue, and that they should raise their voice in many places using those languages. I suppose these examples are more about how across the continent women can raise their voice and show their power is primarily because what background they come from, and they have had a very gender balanced background where there was less domination from male as we are exposed to, or there are less from mainstream position. They are much more liberated, and I suppose that's where that's where gives a kind of better advantage for them compared to other mainstream. Although I would say that these are changing very rapidly, because we are bringing our own mainstreaming identities to them, and they assume those identities are better than their own. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have no other questions from the participants. There is one technical question for Kalpana. If you could write in the chat the name of the book that you mentioned with the pink cover. Someone asked about that book. And I would like to conclude this with 2 points. One is if you have a question that you want to ask to one of the other guests.
Yes. Can I start? I have a question for Kalpana. You mentioned in the very beginning that there was quite a masculine notion of forestry in Nepal, and that the foresters were putting on weight and growing beards to, appear bigger and more respect demanding as forestry men. You see this quite often, and these groups also develop certain rituals that they do together, be it drinking together or having certain contests. And as a woman, you very quickly become the outsider, because you're either not able or not willing to do exactly the same. Have you experienced that, and how did you deal with it?
Okay, give me a second. All right, so I think, yes, certainly, I often call forestry as something like paramilitary, that's my way of doing justice with the forestry rituals or kinship and the network that exists within forestry. So in Nepal, basically, the construction of forestry is so closely associated with male, right? So it really gives a very limited scope for even a female forester, female to fit within that description, right? So like I said, I really struggled to say, okay, what would be my avatar look like? You know, should I also like gain more weight because that time I was very petite, or should I look like a little bit of elderly woman by changing my dressing pattern, you know, dress more maturely, for example, or when I talk, like, do I really show some kind of body language so that people take me in a much more respectful manner? How did I cope with that is, I think it was very clear to me that if I really want to be accepted, then I have to excel, like I said. And second, I think education was my kind of my go-to panacea at that time. So my desire to continue with my PhD was also because I needed to stand out within that forestry crowd, right? And the PhD degree is going to give me that a layer of recognition in that space. I think it also stemmed from that fact. And I would again say that education does help, because there is a difference when I just go and introduce myself, and there's a difference when I say I'm doctor, you know, I have my PhD. I mean, people treat me very differently. There's again a very different set of acceptance towards me than to some of the female candidates who may not have PhD. So I think that was one part of where and how I actually made myself kind of made myself like I think managed within that network. But another deep issue with that whole kinship structure is that I have seen how this forestry networks functions across the Asia Pacific. So nowadays, whenever I go to any university, I sit with the students and I said, okay, what are the things that you do as a forestry crowd, you know, forestry students, what do you do? So for example, in Thailand, they raise a little bit of pocket money, you know, within the students. And then even after you have graduated from the forestry, whenever there's a ceremony or something, every forestry student is actually contributing to that purse, and that purse is going sometime to monks, sometime to relief fund, sometimes something. So there's always a kinship ritual that is perpetuated within the forestry sector where you need to be a part of, right? And where does gender really come into picture is on those positive notes. I think it's really nice because you kind of connect to people even when you are working in forestry field. Like right now, whenever I go to Laos or, you know, like Vietnam, and when people, especially the forest ministers, identify myself as a forester, I immediately get a door open, you know, and this is a privilege that I think all the IFSA student has. The forest kinship actually will be a door opener for you to have that conversation happen, you know. So that's a privilege that I carry as a female forester. The exclusion that I faced is most of the socialization practices within forestry are masculine, right? And it's toxic masculine, right? Not only masculine, okay? Toxic masculine. The type of talk that goes within this circle is very, very misogynistic, very sexist. People think that it's macho, but it's very creepy. It's downright, you know, like talking about women's bodies and parts and what's or not. There's so much of alcohol involved. All right. So, and people kind of naturalize it. And sometimes I also see the tension coming from young males who do not want to identify themselves with that kind of behavior in circles. But in order to get in within that bigger forestry kinship and crowd, they kind of play with it, right? And I think that's where I always say that, call that out. You know, you have every right and every, every metal in yourself to say, you know what, I don't really want to identify that practice as a forestry practice. Can there be better ways we socialize? Can there be better ways we connect as a network? You know, can there be more respectful ways of us working as a forestry network together, right? So I think those kind of things needs to be taken into forward. So for me, even when, like, especially in Asia, another thing that I wanted to put into that is because the circle is so much masculinized, sometimes for female, the challenge is if they take part in that circle, they are kind of, you know, like assassinated, character assassinated, like saying, oh, what kind of female is she? You know, she goes to these male groups who are heavily drunk and talk about nonsense and blah, blah, blah. Maybe she's kind of a cheap woman. Okay, let me say it that way. So your purity and your character is assassinated, especially in Asia. And that's kind of in a society where women's purity is kind of celebrated. it's a huge thing, especially I would say for young forester, female forester to take on and digest, right? So sometimes in order to not to be in that situation, they just let go of the opportunities because it's too much to risk. So I think my point of view is I think I risked a lot because I was also the bad one, you know, I was also called the difficult one, and that's how I survived. But perhaps for the younger generation, it doesn't have to be that difficult. I think if the system opens up and says this type of masculinistic toxic behavior are not only bad for female, it is also toxic for young males who are much more open, who wanted to embrace a much more positive identity of what a male forester should be and should look like as well. So that's why I always say that, yes, we have to be bold, but we also have to question the deficiency in the forestry circle and in the forestry workspaces by saying that, you know, it should open up and it should find new ways to nurture a new kind of kinship and relationship amongst the forestry network. Thank you. Sorry, I took too much time.
Thank you, Kalpana. And I totally agree with your last sentence about that it influences not only women, but all the genders. Thank you for pointing that out. Either Purabi or Kalpana, do you have a question for someone else? No. Okay. Really last point is that we would ask you to, if you have, to share with us a movie, publication, article, YouTube link, or whatever that it's meaningful for you, connected to social aspects, gender matters, or anything else. You can mention it here now, and then maybe I'll ask you if you can send it by email. If you have any, if you don't, it's fine anyways.
I don't really have a book. There are many books that have been written about these issues, and I don't have a particular one. I was just thinking when Purabi was talking about filmmaking and that there are not many female filmmakers, and that's absolutely true. There was one movie that really impressed me by a female filmmaker. I'm not sure exactly where she was from. She may have been from Saudi Arabia, and it was about a young girl who wanted a bicycle, and she was not allowed to ride a bicycle. I think the film was either called The Green Bicycle, or in German it was called Vanja, which was the name of the girl. Some of you may have seen it, but it was a wonderful movie about a young girl who wants to achieve something, and she goes her own way despite many, many difficulties.
Thank you. We'll make sure to find it and to share it. Thank you.
Yeah,
Purabi?
definitely. I think if you go to Landing Together website, you would see some of the films that I have directed and produced. And just to tell you that these are all from my own funding. So it was not funded by any institutions to avoid the propaganda. So it might not be that that kind of a standard, but definitely it comes from my heart, and it's very passionate topic for me. Related to today's topic on gender and forestry, there are 3 films that I would suggest would be worth watching at least the trailer before you all decide whether it's good or not. First is Abadiyat. It's about indigenous women across 4 or 5 different states, indigenous territories, in different landscapes, and how indigenous women are managing community forestry and what are their challenges. Then the other one is Tara. It's about forest food, because often forest food is collected by women, and how they are finding the changes that is affecting their livelihoods, their family. And so that is another film that I would say. And then one more short film is called Kabza. It's about extractive industries, how extractive industries, mining and other mineral resource extractions is actually depleting the forest and is hurting women's identity and their social security. So that's about films. And of course, you might want to, if you're interested about indigenous knowledge and how it impacts how it is related to scientific knowledge, then I would say my keynote at IUFRO in Brazil would be something interesting to read at. So, and apart from there is a special issue that I think would be interesting for some of you interested in Latin America. It's Women's Studies International Forum Journal, where we have come up with a special issue on land tenure and forest rights in Latin America, and specifically looking at women's rights. So that might be another interesting kind of topic to look at.
Thank you.
Okay, I think for me, if you want to read more about gender community forestry, especially in Asia, then please go through the website of RECOF. I'm sure Damiano and Barbara can share that with you. There's a lot of work that brings the perspective of community voices, both male, female, also from the indigenous groups, and how forest as a science can be actually exclusionary to certain groups of people, what kind of power relations are in place. So I think feel free to browse through the articles and write to me if you want to explore some topics. Another thing that I definitely want all of you to go and check out is the website. There's also a video. And why that? Because it would actually give you and familiarize you with some of the people who are making the call, right? And saying that here is an inequality issue in forestry space. And this is an issue because this creates this kind of problems. And here is how I'm going to solve it. And you see like a forest university professor who is actually making the call to make the curriculum more inclusive. You see a young female student sharing their experiences. You see a male forestry gender champion, making different changes within the HR. So it gives you, like solutions that you might also want to give a try to. For me, I think WIFS is my soul feeding network where I always go back in times of when I feel scared or vulnerable. So I hope it would also give you some solutions and some positive energy to carve out something within the forest spaces.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the inputs. One question that goes with a yes or no, since I would like to make it longer, but I cannot. Have you been an IFSA member? Yes or no?
I think when I was a student, IFSA did not yet exist.
Probably not back then, yeah.
Yes. I think in 2005, I went to France, I presented, I mingled with IFSA groups. So I'm like one of the, let's say, the young, energetic IFSA member back in 2005. So yes.
Nice. Purabi?
I just heard about you all a few years ago, so yes.
Okay, nice. Okay, really shortly, thank you very much for being with us and for the wonderful discussion we had. It was really, really inspiring, and I'm sure it was the same for all the participants. And since we're late, I'll give the word to Barbara. She's going to summarize everything. And thank you very much again, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Damiano. I also want to thank all three of you, Purabi, Kalpana, and Eva. It was a wonderful discussion, and I felt honored to listen to you as a young forester who often feels ill-equipped to unpack and address the social dimensions of forestry, as it was said during the discussion. So thank you for all the valuable insights you've given and your perspectives. I also want to thank the Forest and Women's Science Task Force of IFSA, and especially Damiano for facilitating the discussion in such a beautiful way. Thank you to all participants who have joined us today. Thank you for the great interest in the discussion. I would like to invite everyone to also join the Forest and Women's Hands Conference, which will take place next week from the 12th to the 13th of April. I shared the links in the chat. You can also go back and watch the recording of last week's episode. And then I would like to conclude the session with a quote from today. become the conversation. You need to be more than us. You need to be more progressive. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.